Hello, my friends, Takuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast. And once again, in history, it appears that Russia is weaponizing food. Russia strikes Danube River port, escalating attacks on Ukrainian agriculture. So I suppose before things really begin today, I wanted to go ahead and lay down the groundwork of what exactly we're going to be talking about today, because it's not exactly just one incident. We're going to be talking about something that is a larger historical topic as a whole. And first, from among all of that, I suppose we need to begin with the elephant in the room, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, and what exactly has happened to cause a breakdown in this grain initiative that had started last year. Next up, we're going to be talking about the impact of this breakdown, because as I'm going to explain later, this whole thing is not an isolated incident, but rather it's something that is set to affect the entire world, and some regions significantly more so than others. And lastly, what we're going to talk about is the history of weaponizing food. Because mind you, this is not the first time in history that anything like this has happened. Food has been weaponized many different times in the past, but what we're talking about now has greater implications for the global world and market, and simultaneously, this is something that has already occurred between Russia and Ukraine in the past. But those are the three sections. There's going to be timestamps down in the description below, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. There are some really monumentous things that are going on in today's world. According to reports from the Ukrainian Army Operational Command South, Russia had launched drone strikes on Monday against Ukraine's ports on the Danube River, with the aim of this attack being to thwart Kyiv's bid to try and redirect its grain exports after Moscow ended up terminating a UN-brokered deal in order to allow said grain exports onto the global market, something that would have helped to protect these local shipments that now just does not seem to be a thing. 7 people were injured, a hangar with grain was destroyed, and cargo storage terminals were damaged. 5 people over the course of this attack were injured and ended up being taken to hospital, where we know of that at least one person was in critical condition, but not really much else. It was for around 4 hours that the Russians would end up attacking the ports with Iranian-made drones, specifically the Shahed 136 drones that you can see behind me here. 3 drones ended up being destroyed by Ukrainian air defense, but we are unaware of just how many drones managed to hit their targets in the first place. And this doesn't appear to be the first incident of anything like this happening. Russia has been bombarding Ukraine's Black Sea ports for the past week now, as it withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative that was launched around a year ago today. I mean, for anyone watching this, you have to understand, but prior to the invasion by Russia, Ukraine was one of the world's largest exporter of grain. In this case, specifically wheat, but in addition to that, they were also exporting things like sunflower oil, being one of the largest producers of that as well. They would ship quite regularly something along the lines of 5 million metric tons of grains and oilseeds a month through these Black Sea ports. It is a absolutely mind-bogglingly large amount. But of course, it's precisely because of how large an amount of food that we're talking about here and what it would do for the country that this is something that Putin doesn't exactly like. The announcement that Russia gave here reflects Vladimir Putin's position that this UN-brokered deal is something that has allowed Ukraine to stand tall against him. Russia has been unable to capitulate Ukraine through force, and so one of the things that they appear to be trying to do here at this point is to utilize economic means to do so. And this announcement that he gave around a week ago came only hours after blasts seriously damaged the Kerch Bridge that links mainland Ukraine with the Crimean Peninsula. This is one of the key lifelines in Moscow's control that they need for control of the region. Like, this is a bridge which provides crucial overland supply routes for troops, for weapons, for fuel, for everything that they possibly need in order to pass, and the loss of that, even temporarily, could severely disrupt supply lines on the front. This bridge was hugely important, both symbolically and practically, for Vladimir Putin, as he himself opened the bridge back in 2018. The bridge was also the target of a counteroffensive by Ukraine this last October, but now at this point, Putin seems to have had enough. I'm going to present this next part kind of word for word because Ukraine's security services ended up publishing a poem after the attack on this bridge, which was just a very interesting thing to do in the first place, if I may add. But it appears from this poem that they initially claimed responsibility, and this is what this thing says. Nightingale, my dear brother, the bridge has gone to sleep again. Once, twice. P.S. The music is folk. The words are by the security service of Ukraine. So as this happened, they go and release this kind of cryptic poem, which I don't even really know what to make sense of here in the first place, and I'm not going to try and overanalyze it. But then, of course, we don't exactly have to wait for guesswork, because Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar then recently acknowledged that, yes, Kyiv is responsible for this specific attack. And Russia was less than happy, to say the Middle East. And so with that, Russia began to complain that the agreements underpinning the grain deal had been the target of outright sabotage. And the Foreign Ministry of Russia then announced the end to the guarantees of safe navigation, the curtailment of the maritime humanitarian corridor, and, quote, the restoration of the regime of a temporarily dangerous area in the northwestern Black Sea. I do not think that I'm capable of understating just how severely important something like this is. The Black Sea grain deal had effectively offered a lifeline to Ukrainian farmers for the past year to be able to export their crops in the first place, and simultaneously to support food insecure nations who needed these goods in the first place. Because it wasn't just the region, it was the entire agricultural market of the world that was hit after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This being something that occurred around a year and a half ago, beginning in February of 2022. But even though Putin has repeatedly threatened in the past before to cancel the grain deal, this time he actually has followed through. And there's not really anything that Ukraine can do in the situation except keep on trying to export grain and find alternate routes to get it out there. In a kind of act of defiance, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, would then announce, even without the Russian Federation, everything must be done so that we can use the Black Sea corridor. And they do really have to try. The Black Sea corridor, as I'm going to explain later on in this video, is responsible for something along the lines of half to 75% of all grain exports. It is a massive amount, as it is the cheapest and most efficient way by which grain can be exported. And that's a really big deal. This entire thing is a really big deal because it's not something that is just going to be affecting Ukraine. This is going to be affecting the global food supply and access to grains, and it's going to drive up prices of these grains in the market all over the world. It is just another example in history of food being weaponized, and it's really ironic that this is now the second time in history that Russia would do this specifically to Ukraine. But that all being said, I will be talking more about that specific part here later. The amount of food that this is going to be affecting for the global market is truly mind-bogglingly and insane. The Black Sea Initiative, which was first brokered by the UN in Turkey this past July, is something that allowed around 33 million metric tons of grain to be exported. And so according to UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, hundreds of millions of people all over the world are facing food insecurity issues. And simultaneously, with the past several years, consumer confidence is dropping every single year. We are facing a global cost of living crisis, and something like this is only going to make everything worse. The people of the world are the ones who are ultimately going to have to pay more of this price. And so now for anyone watching this, you're probably looking at me and going, well, why? Why is that the case? Why are we talking about the entire world when this is one country here? Many people are not necessarily processing just how much grain we're talking about here and how that's capable of affecting a globalized market. In the run-up to the July 17th deadline, the number of shipments that had been leaving from Ukraine utilizing this deal had fallen drastically, dropping from around 1.3 million metric tons in May from 4.2 million last October, a drop by over half. If anything, looking at this now, trying to do the math on the top of my head, that's a reduction of like, what, 70%? And no new vessels transporting grain were registered under the initiative since the end of June. Because of the loss of the Black Sea, that means that Ukraine is going to have to prepare alternate routes in order to be able to transport anything, by truck, by rail, by things like this. And when you have to do that, these are modes of transportation that are significantly less efficient than transporting by sea. You can take a lot less for more cost, which in turn means that the cost of that is going to transfer onto two things. The farmers are going to be making less, so they're less likely to be able to grow or make more in the first place, and simultaneously, that means that the food coming out of Ukraine here is going to be more expensive on the global market, driving up prices as there's less of it. Aid agencies all over the world now have to prepare for the impact of the deal's end on global food prices. The reality of the situation is that this is going to be affecting and hitting people all over the world in some of the more vulnerable areas significantly harder than it would for the majority of people that are probably watching this now. Over the course of only around a week, wheat prices managed to rise 12% already, and who knows what potentially this would be able to get to here in the future. Without the deal, as I said, Ukraine is forced to use alternate means of transportation, which is just going to raise the cost further, driving that onto the consumers. And the situation means that the poorest countries in Africa and the Middle East, which are significantly more dependent specifically upon food aid, and also on Russian and Ukrainian wheat, they are going to be significantly more affected than any any other kinds of people. I mean, you have to think about this. If you only have a set amount of money for food and around 20% of your budget already specifically goes towards food, if the cost of that increases, that means a larger percentage of your budget specifically has to go towards food. Thus, for some of the places that are significantly more harder affected, if their budget is already 70% dedicated towards food, then this is going to hit them significantly worse than any other kinds of people. This is going to disproportionately affect these poorer areas, and not only them for those that are buying food, but also the aid organizations that are trying to provide food in the first place. And as how Russia is responding to all of this and the criticism, well, I have this quote directly from Vladimir Putin himself. Quote, "We understand the importance of an uninterrupted food supply for the socio-economic development and maintenance of the political instability of African states. Based on this, we have always paid great attention to issues related to the supply of wheat, barley, corn, and other crops to African countries." Which is kind of ironic considering what it is that we're talking about. They're definitely paying attention to it, but not in the way that the rest of the world would actually like. More so of an abusive relationship right now, it seems. At the same time, one of the things that Putin has continuously repeated, even though it has been rebutted many, many times, is that only around 3% of the grain that is shipped under the Black Sea grain deal actually went to these poorer countries. But that's not true. In reality, this initiative would help things like the World Food Program transport more than 725,000 tons of wheat to these countries in 2021. Places like Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, etc. Ukraine alone was responsible for supplying more than half of the World Food Program's wheat in 2022, as well as 2021. Half. And as you can imagine from that number, a 50% supply source is a really big deal, but it's only something that is getting worse. Because the potential that this entire thing has to affect the conflict is terrible. It could make it significantly worse, just in the same way that starvation and other things have been used as a tactic in the past. And I suppose that part is where we're going to be getting into the history of all this, is that's what I like to tie each one of these episodes back to, is how this thing reflects our historical past. Because guys, I'm just saying this right now, but since the very beginning of time, humans have always utilized starvation and trying to limit one's food supply as a tactic against their enemies. The Romans did it, the Germans did it. Hell, the British back during World War I seemed to weaponize food not only against their enemy, the Germans, but simultaneously against their own subjects, the Indians. Food is always something that has been used as a kind of weapon of choice when it comes to war, as it's one of the most effective things that can be done in order to hurt your enemy. And among all the potential countries that could be wrapped up in a conflict with one another, the fact that this is occurring with Russia and Ukraine, two of the largest producers of food in the world, that is a really big deal. If, as an example, we went and combined Russia and Ukraine's food commodities that were exported over just the year 2021, these would account for around 23% of all of the wheat in the world, 21.6% of barley, around 13 or 14% of corn, half of all sunflower oil, and when you look at the two together, these two countries are responsible for around 12% of the global supply of calories, which is a lot. The conflict has thus triggered a calorie deficit, which only adds to other countries' already severe issues when it comes to food and calories in the first place. Like, as an example of all of this, I'm going to talk about the country Nigeria. Although this is a bustling country of approximately 70 million people, around 32% of those people live below the poverty line, which is an extremely large amount in the first place. More than a third of Nigeria's children today have stunted growth, and this is something that is only expected to get worse. Nigeria as a state is something that heavily depends upon specifically Russia for its wheat. And as a result of this, the entire country could be looking at a famine over the course of the next couple years. But there are many other countries that have it significantly worse, such as Lebanon, Egypt, and Somalia. Because when talking about these countries' relations to Russia and Ukraine, they are dependent upon them for food for something along the lines of 60 to 80% of their wheat imports. Hell, in the case of Somalia, it's actually more like 90%. Lebanon as a country still really isn't recovering after the Beirut explosion that had occurred in 2020, and their situation has only been getting worse by the year. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine have effectively pushed these countries into their own food security crisis, something that they're not really able to get out of on their own. Now, of course, in me saying that, I have gone back into modern times when talking about this, but the reality of the situation is that weaponizing food is not limited to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict alone. alone. It is something that has always occurred in history, as I said. If we go back over 2,000 years, the Romans regularly used hunger tactics in order to defeat their enemies, such as when they destroyed Carthage in 146 BC. The tactics that they used included destroying food, farms, water supplies, cutting off the besieged enemies' populations. Anything that they could do when they were attacking an enemy, they would do so to wipe them out if they could. Starvation tactics, as I mentioned before, were also used by the British back during World War I, specifically in order to choke out Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Central Powers. Considering that Britain had overwhelming sea power, there just really wasn't much that the Germans were able to do in order to challenge them here, which in turn meant that the British were able to establish a blockade of Germany by August of 1914 at the very beginning of the war. When they did so, they issued a comprehensive list of contraband that prohibited nations, including the Americans, from trading with Germany, with Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, which was then, at the time, the Ottoman Empire. By early 1914, the British declared that the entirety of the North Sea zone was a war zone, and that any ships that were entering this at that time did so at their own risk. A similar blockade was also done down in the Adriatic Sea around Italy in order to deprive things from Austria-Hungary, or in that case, from Germany being able to import stuff through Austria-Hungary. And the blockades were unusually restricted in the sense that even foodstuffs were considered to be contraband items. It wasn't just weapons or material that could be used for war. Even food was going to be deprived of the enemy in order to try and starve them into submission. Germany simply couldn't find enough food in order to feed its people, since the majority of its young farmers seemed to end up in the military. And with them not at home to actually produce food and being on the front lines consuming food, that meant that by 1916 or 1917, desperate Germans were forced to just eat turnips. And we're talking about things here in terms of food, as in someone not being able to necessarily import grain, but in addition to things like stopping the import of coal, of metal, of other things that could be used for industrial goods, they even stopped the import of things like fertilizer, which meant that if the country wasn't able to get its own fertilizer produced or made, then even the farms that they had that were still productive were going to be producing significantly less than they had in the previous years, thus hurting them even more. And because of this lack of fertilizer, this meant that staples such as grain, potatoes, meat, and dairy products became so scarce by the end of 1916 that many people ended up being forced to have to eat war bread, something called Kriegsbrot. The food shortages got so bad that there were regularly food riots in the Central Powers where desperate civilians were trying to get their hands on more food. Hell, one of the things that ended up even happening is that Austria-Hungary, the ally of Germany in World War I, ended up stealing ships that were on their way down the Danube River in order to deliver food supplies to Germany. They just hijacked the ships and took the food off of them because they needed it that badly. Over the course of the conflict, the Germans would estimate that around 760,000 civilians would end up dying of starvation and disease that was directly caused by this blockade. Hunger was definitely something that played a major part in the defeat of the Central Powers. And all of this is just one example. I have many more that are readily available of how many times this has been done in history. When the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa back in 1941, there was something that they had called the Hunger Plan. This was something that over the course of the German invasion into the Soviet Union that year, over the course of the next 3 years, they would manage to starve something along the lines of 4.2 million Soviet citizens. They weren't just trying to break the Soviet state, they were specifically trying to eradicate the Soviet people. America had used somewhat similar tactics in order to try and drive the Native Americans away out of the Midwest. Specifically, after the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the American government ended up killing tens of millions of buffalo in order to try and starve and drive out the Native Americans out of the Midwest. These were a people that specifically relied on the buffalo for everything for their way of life, so by killing them, that would remove the ability for these natives to stay in their land. In the early 1800s, millions of these creatures roamed across the plains, and by the end, in 1893, the bison had shrunk to a population of only around 400. And I mean, we spent this time talking about things with food, but also, as we mentioned with fertilizer, there are other things that will end up severely affecting logistics that can easily be blockaded and hurt by other people. Like you can see the image behind me here, which is a classic example of something that had been seen from the 1973 to 74 oil crisis, something in which the Arab nations ended up imposing an oil embargo on the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, South Africa, Japan, and other industrialized nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War of October of 1973. The result of that embargo was that oil supplies across the world diminished and the prices of it absolutely skyrocketed. skyrocketed. When the price of oil goes up, this is something that can severely affect countries, and in particular places like the United States, which are heavily dependent upon oil in order to be able to transport any other kinds of goods. And think about it here for a second. And think of it like this. You have a country, like America, with a massive highway system that is specifically dependent upon transporting large amounts of goods to its people, population, and distribution centers by road utilizing trucks that require oil. So if the price of oil goes up and it becomes harder to transport things, that means that it's not just the cost of oil that is going up, it is the cost of every single thing in the country that relies on it in order to be able to transport those goods in the first place. If we go on and look later in the 2010s, aided and abetted by the United States and British foreign policy, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates led a blockade to isolate the people of Yemen. This entire thing, which is something that is still ongoing to this day, is arguably one of the worst humanitarian crises to ever face the world. Of the 30 million people inside of Yemen, around 19 million of those are considered to be food insecure. Over 20 million of them need some kind of humanitarian assistance as of 2022, with millions of those people now suffering from acute malnutrition, in particular after the Saudis cut off any import of food that could be done from the Red Sea port at Hodeidah, that being the main entry point for Yemen's food imports that it had been using for years. I know that at this point in time it may seem a little bit confusing because with the examples that I've been pulling up over the course of human history, it's a very broad subject, but we have to understand that starvation is something that has been used as one of the oldest weapons of war in the human arsenal. And generally speaking, tactics whose purpose is designed to be able to starve out an enemy is not something that is as commonly used today as it was back then, but there are still examples. Around 169 states have ratified the 1977 Geneva Conventions that specifically banned the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, but the situation that we're talking about with Russia and Ukraine is a bit different. It's not something that necessarily quite applies there, because the ones that are being affected most in these circumstances are not actually the Ukrainians. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Ukrainians are definitely people that are being affected by this, but their effect is more economic than anything else. At least right now. The ones who are primarily being affected by this are the rest of the world. I mean, Europe as an example is now trapped in a deepening economic spiral with soaring energy prices, runaway inflation, and cost of living increases that is stopping consumer spending. And when consumer spending stops, this means that economy weakens, and when economies weaken, that means that manufacturers are going to slash new orders. When they slash new orders, that is going to spark even more issues as people lose their jobs, which in turn creates even more of a labor crisis than what they are already facing. And all of this, everything that I have been talking about, has not even considered the tragic irony that what is happening now is Russia once again in its history affecting Ukrainian food supply and utilizing it as a weapon in order to try and crush the Ukrainian people. This is something that they had done around 100 years earlier in a little event called the Holodomor. Now, considering the sheer amount of horrible images that specifically occurred of this event, I'm not going to try and show a whole bunch of it. And I'm not going to show a whole bunch of it because I don't want to run the risk that in an event that was as terrible as it was, that YouTube ends up taking an issue with me here in my entire video. So what I'm going to do is just try to explain this to the best of my ability with a few images that I can. The term Holodomor, or death by hunger in Ukrainian, refers to the starvation of millions of Ukrainians over the course of 1932 to 1933 as a direct result of Soviet policies. With the collapse of the Russian Empire back in the year 1917, Ukraine managed for a time to briefly become independent, but then of course the communist revolution would end up succeeding in Russia, and the new Soviet Union would then take over the surrounding territories, gradually incorporating Ukraine back into the Soviet bloc. And at first, the Soviets didn't really want to necessarily piss off the Ukrainian population, so what they had done at the time was given them a degree of autonomy, something that was a policy known as indigenization, in which the population was able to mostly govern and do things themselves. But by the end of the 1920s, the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, well, he didn't really like this whole thing anymore. He decided that what he needed to do was to curtail Ukraine's cultural autonomy and launch a campaign of intimidation, arrest, imprisonment, and execution of thousands of Ukrainians, intellectuals, artists, and anyone that could potentially challenge the regime in order to be able to weaken their control of the country and strengthen Soviet control. At the same time that these intellectual leaders were being arrested, Stalin would also simultaneously order the collectivization of agriculture agriculture. The majority of Ukrainians, which had been smaller, more subsistence-level farmers that had their own small farms, were instead collectivized into massive communal farms where all had to work the same land in order to be able to increase efficiency. And for the Ukrainians, as I said, since they were majority small farmers who had their own plots of land, they resisted this, and as a result of that, the state would confiscate the property of independent farmers and instead force them to work into these collective farms. The individual farmers among these who were a little bit more prosperous, as in they had a couple of their own animals, some more tools, maybe a little bit more land than the rest, well, these were individuals that were branded as kulaks, as rich peasants, and they were heavily punished. They were declared to be enemies of the state, and many tens of thousands of them were shipped out of Ukraine specifically in order to serve in the Siberian gulags, the prisons. Thousands upon thousands of these individuals would be thrown out of their homes and deported out of the country. And so, okay, now with the enemies of the Soviet Union out of the country, they could truly begin to collectivize agriculture and punish the Ukrainian people. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in 1932, the Communist Party would end up setting impossibly high quotas for the amount of grain that Ukrainian villages were supposed to be contributing to the Soviet state. The way that this essentially worked at the time was that the farmers had to supply the grain to the state would sell the grain abroad, and then utilize the money in order to be able to industrialize their society. The farmers didn't really get much of a say in this matter. But remember that I said that the quotas of these were incredibly high, so high to the point that many villages were simply not able to meet the standard that was being set for them. And when this standard was not able to be met for the crops that were grown, they were punished. Authorities would launch massive requisition campaigns in which every single kind of foodstuff would end up being seized from the people, including the grain that was necessary in order to be able to plant that year for the next year's crop. Special teams would be sent to search homes and even seize other foodstuffs, and starving farmers would attempt to leave their villages in search of food, only for Soviet authorities to find them, arrest them, and ship them back to the country and their farms where they worked. Something that was effectively a death sentence for any of these farmers. Laws were introduced so that even the theft of just only a few stalks of grain was something that could cause all of your property to be confiscated and simultaneously for you to be executed and your family shipped off to the gulags. There have been arguments that have been written that said that the central authorities didn't really know about what was happening at the time or how severe it was because of the communist authorities needing to have perfection. And although the central authorities were informed of the dire situation that was going on inside of Ukraine, many of them simply didn't care, as it was something that was going to enable the Soviets to further control the population by whittling down any resistance that could potentially, resist them. Local officials were then ordered to extract even more from the population, and as a result of this, millions of people would end up starving inside of Ukraine, as the USSR would just end up taking the crops and selling them abroad in order to raise money for the state, as I said earlier. Now, for years after all this happened, the USSR denied that the Holodomor ever actually occurred. It wasn't really until the collapse of the Soviet Union that the Communist Party, the secret police, and all the government archives and everything that had occurred during this period became exposed to the wider public, and we were able to then piece together the sheer scope of what happened here. From what researchers were able to find, this wasn't something that occurred just out of a simple mistake by Soviet authorities. Rather, this was something that seemed to have been done as a deliberate attempt to try and break the Ukrainian people. So I guess we could say here that, in the end, the history of food security between Russia and Ukraine and how all of that goes down, it's not something that is a clean one. And it is something that is likely only going to be getting worse as time goes on. To be honest, who knows what we're going to be looking at around a year from now or so. But if it is anything like what the past has seen, we're going to be seeing some major conflicts that are going to be breaking out all over the world as not only food, but water and other resources become more and more scarce. Everyone, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate all of you, and please let me know in the comment section below what other kind of topics that we should be covering next. And I really do hope that a lot of you who are watching this appreciate what we have been doing and can give us some more ideas on what type of content in order to create. The goal of what we decided to do here with the YouTube channel is that we're going to be talking about things that are a little bit more relevant to today's day and age, but then simultaneously talking about the historical context and past of it. So if there's any current topics, if there's anything that is going on in the world today that people want to know about and to understand the background of, then please let me know down in the comment section below. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you all next time. Thank you everyone for supporting us, and goodbye, guys.